Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, which is the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 37,906 people from 160 countries and is supported by 527 organisations. We have volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent. Please join us and you can become a member of WDI to help our work. You can volunteer or donate. So today I am really pleased to introduce our speakers. We have Aurora Linnea from the USA, and she's going to talk about the Beguines medieval women-only space. And then we have Lorraine Nowlin from USA, and she's going to introduce the video that she made with birth worker Umi Ray, discussing gender identity ideology impacting birth work. And then Angela Wilde from the UK, No Men Beyond This Point, which will talk about a conceptual radfem art project and invite women to come along and talk about that. And then finally, right at the end, we're going to show Joanna Cherry's unbelievably brilliant speech in the UK Parliament related to Lesbian Visibility Week. I'm really pleased now to introduce our first speaker, who is Aurora Linnea. She's a radical eco-feminist writer making her home in the state of Maine. She's a regular contributor to Women's Liberation Radio News blog. And the title of Aurora's talk is The Beguines, Medieval Women-Only Space.
So I'm going to be talking about the Beguines as a women's movement and the women's only communities that they developed in the Middle Ages. As it turns out, Jo and I have a real mutual affection for the Beguines, and so she called me in to talk about this, but I will have her pop in to give any thoughts that she has as I go through. So I've been really fascinated by the Beguines since I found out about them a few years ago, as a really illustrative and inspiring example of the possibilities of women's autonomous communities, as well as a historical look at the threat that they pose to men in power and the subsequent persecution that they face. As a consequence of threatening male power. So the Beguines, as a basic overview, the Beguines were women who came together to live in these informal religious communities that spread across Europe and became really influential and prominent and very large during the Middle Ages, beginning in around the 11th century. Because of these women's efforts to create a way of life for themselves as females outside of direct male rule, whether that was the rule of church leadership or the rule of a husband, historians have called the Beguines the first European women's movement. And so the women came together in these communities, which grew over time. And what they were seeking was independence from male authority. They also wanted a more self-directed religious practice that wasn't dictated to them by male church leaders, which was the case for women who were in convents. Women also were looking for a way to have greater economic opportunity and economic independence. So to own property and not have it be absorbed by a husband or by the church. And also women just looking for a more supportive communal lifestyle situation with other women. And so those were the real goals. And these women developed the Beguine approach as a means of securing these greater freedoms while still operating enough within the cultural constraints of the period, which were quite stringent, the Middle Ages, to avoid immediate patriarchal condemnation and persecution. So the Beguines were able to have to really do a lot of quite subversive and radical things as women in this period, in part through maintaining a guise of being good women uh, in their community. So they did play on that for sure. They were devout and all of this. But in this way, they were able to become, the communities were very large, as I said, and they survived for centuries, which is pretty remarkable. However, they still did ultimately end up suffering really significant backlash from patriarchal power, both civic and the church, and were quite significantly harassed. Many women who were Beguines were executed as heretics, and the campaigns against them were severe. However, they were never successful in fully quashing the movement. So there were still active Beguine colonies as late as the early 20th century. So what really put an end to the Beguine way of life was increasing opportunity for women in the public sphere in the 19th and 20th centuries. To give some historical context to the rise of the Beguines, which did these communities started to be established in the early 11th century, which was the time of the Crusades. So there was a real depopulation of men. They all went to go kill other men, and as typically happens when men go off to wars, and there are more single women able to do things other than get married. Women become more independent and look for other ways of living. So women were moving into urban centers. This was also a period of rising urbanization in Northern Europe. And so women were moving to the cities, and they were looking for work and started to live together in these cities. And that was kind of a real beginning to the formation of these communities. Another factor at this period that enabled the Beguines to begin to come into being was that it was a period of rising literacy and education for women. And as we know, when women have opportunities to be educated, they begin to imagine lives for themselves outside of patriarchally prescribed roles. And that was as true in the medieval period as it is now. And so that kind of lays the groundwork for the emergence of the Beguines. And so these communities started forming with religious women, or ostensibly religious women, coming to live together in smaller homes in the early 11th century, particularly in what's called the Low Countries, so Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, with Belgium being really the hub of the Beguine movement through its history. But so this was where it started, and then over the next couple of centuries, it really spread so that there were Beguine communities of different scales in almost every town or city in Northern Europe, and also with quite large populations of Beguines in France and Germany and in the Scandinavian countries, as well as kind of sister movements that were doing very similar things under a different name in Spain and Italy as well. And Beguines were women from all social classes. The connecting tie was femaleness. So there were women who were aristocrats, women from the merchant class, widows and daughters of knights, as well as women coming from the urban and the rural poor, all came together to live in these Beguine communities. Girls could enter as young as 14, and then women would live there their entire lives. So very mixed. Also interesting to note that there was a male corollary to the Beguine movement, and these were called the Beguards, but it never really took off in the same way. It didn't have the same numbers, didn't have the same cultural sway, presumably just in large part because men had more opportunities in general to live outside of their homes than did women. And also, male monastics, so in monasteries, weren't cloistered like nuns were, which brings me to the kind of really salient differences. It's really important to understand that Beguines were not nuns. This was an informal religious order. They were not endorsed by the church and were indeed often condemned by the church. I'll talk about a little bit later. And so they weren't nuns. They were not beholden to any church dictated monastic rule. They didn't take vows of poverty, and they could retain their property. They were not cloistered, so they had real freedom of movement, unlike nuns who sort of, once you join a convent in the Middle Ages, certainly women were like stuck there. And as Beguines, women performed active ministry and studied theology in quite a serious way, which even nuns were not encouraged to do. And they didn't take binding vows. So they maintained self-determination enough so that they could leave the beguinage if they chose to pursue, well, to get married often, is what women would leave for. But they could do so without risking excommunication or losing all of their reputation. They had freedom to come and go. And really, the most exciting thing to talk about with the Beguines is the beguinages, is these women's communities that they developed, which were women-only spaces, quite seriously. Indeed, many of them, the larger ones, had walls built around them, and some allowed male visitors, some didn't, but there were certainly no like unsupervised men in these communities. It was quite strict. There were different sort of community organizational styles with Beguines. So you could, as a Beguine, just stay in your family home and declare yourself a Beguine and do it on your own. There were also some solo Beguines who lived a more mendicant lifestyle, so they were beggars. There were also smaller communal houses, or maybe 2 or 3 houses with women who lived collectively as Beguines. And then there were these larger, more formally organized communities that were called the beguinages. The largest of which were, you can read about them as being called cities within cities, or my favorite is miniature towns populated solely by women. They were really quite expansive, and they were called court beguinages, or cities of Beguines. And up to several thousand women would live in these. So in the larger beguinages like Ghent and Neville, which are Belgian cities, there would be as many as 3,000 women living together in these spaces. They were independent parishes. They functioned as villages unto themselves under women's direction. And again, there were these in most of the cities and towns in Northern Europe at this time. So imagine if like any city you went to had a women's land. It's quite extraordinary. I read a really lovely description of the court beguinage as a formidable institution, which would typically comprise a church. They had their own cemeteries. The women ran infirmaries or hospitals, and were quite renowned for this, and as medical practitioners. There were gardens and agricultural fields, bakeries, workshops for craftswomen, and then there could be as many as 100 houses for single women houses, as well as these larger dormitory style houses, which were called convents, in which younger women and women of lesser means lived together. So for example, the Beguinage at Ghent had 18 of these large dormitory houses and 100 or over 100 single women homes. So these were really substantial. And a lot of the complexes are still intact, though Beguines don't live there anymore, but open to visitors. And indeed, I think Jo has visited them. Did you want to say anything about your experiences visiting these places?
Can see from the architecture that they are well, you could imagine that you could I could see that they're built by women. They're much more modest, less grandiose. They're sort of small buildings together in a community and incredibly beautiful. So this is one in Courtridge, which is part of in Brussels, and then there's a Beguines quarter in Amsterdam, but loads of the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, those sort of areas, Germany, Flanders, they had them. And now this, I'm just going to whiz through these because I think they illustrate what you've been saying a bit. So they were outside of male control, not submitting to monastic order. They were self-defined in opposition to many attempts to control them and define them. They lived in communities, and they were also in Bruges, Brussels, walled in rows of houses where hundreds of them lived together. And there's this book, which I haven't read, by Laura Swan, which might be interesting to read, The Wisdom of the Beguines, the forgotten story of a medieval women's movement. And then that fantastic image of this. I mean, it's such a great picture. And I'm just going to show some more images of these. And the middle image shows the women praying, and then they're under the wing of a man, or a man's wing. But what seemed to happen, and then I'll just show these other prints of a 1489 Begin and then one in Ghent. This sort of quite stern and powerful looking Begin from Ghent as well. A thing that I really loved about when I lived in Belgium for a long time, in Brussels, so there's quite a lot of knowledge about the Begins, was that they were sort of under male control, but they changed it. They made it their own space, and they they started to have their own direct relationship with God, and then they started to create God in their own image. And there's a fantastic exhibition I went to in 1996 in Brussels. It was of Beguine art by women, and one of the paintings had Jesus with breasts. And I thought, wow, they have decided that God is female. And isn't that massively subversive? And then, of course, there's this sort of contradiction now, because Jesus or men having breasts it means a whole totally different thing. But at the time, I sort of thought, wow, these women were just getting on with making a world of their own, a women's land. They were, and then they, as you said, they all got shut down. And there was a massive backlash against them. And then, the witch hunts came in as the Beguinages declined. Women were absolutely not allowed to be outside male control, and there was this huge backlash. So
yeah, so highly recommended is The Wisdom of the Beguines.
oh.
It's a wonderful book. If you're interested in this at all, it's like a nice, quick little book. It's great. So one of the other things about these about Beguine community life is that they were very self-sufficient, and they developed that intentionally as a way of protecting their autonomy. So in Beguinages, women worked. They received some sort of endowments, but mostly they were sustained by the women's own work. And so Beguines worked. They were very prominent in the textile industry as weavers, spinners. They made dresses. They did lace work, embroidery, and they had a great deal of economic success there. So much so, in fact, that they came into conflict with male run professional guilds. And that was part of their downfall, is that they were really attacked by these male professional guilds who were unhappy with them competing for business in the textiles industry. Also, the women ran these infirmaries or hospitals, as I said, and part of that was their service work. So they helped the poor and poor women in particular at these hospitals, but they also did have fees for that, for caring for the wealthier people in these in the cities that they were close to. Some Beguines were merchants, which was really quite rare at the time for women to be merchants. Beguines did illumination work on manuscripts. They ran schools on site for local children and were really respected and revered as educators. And then they also did like housekeeping and laundry services, and ran bakeries and all of these things that allowed the Beguinages to be self-sufficient and economically independent from the church. Another aspect of the Beguinage community that I think is really wonderful is that these were really, really women-centered. So all property was passed down to female relatives who agreed to join the Beguinage, or it was sold to other women within the Beguinage. So they maintained the collective pool of property, and it went down matrilineal lines. Their service work was also really geared towards women, caring for poor women and widows and older women in the infirmaries. I've also read of Beguines providing sanctuary and assistance to women who are trying to get out of prostitution at that point. And they also rented rooms out in the Beguinages to women who didn't want to join the order, but wanted to live outside of the severities of direct male dominion. So they rented rooms out to widows and other women without requiring them to join. Also, unlike in a cloister, they were able to maintain relationships with female friends and family. And so the Beguinages were also always full of female relatives visiting and staying for longer periods of time. And also nice is that the houses, the convents, dormitory houses, were often named after female saints. And so the kind of points of reverence and reference for Beguine spirituality were women. And indeed, as Jo was saying, they did develop within these women's communities, they developed as much of a woman-centered theology as you can get with Christianity, linking femaleness to sanctity and re-envisioning God in more female terms as a mother, which it's I think really lovely to see how having the material space of the women's community allows for this kind of re-envisioning of culture to occur. As far as escaping male authority, there were a lot of ways that the Beguines did that really cleverly. They were very business savvy and used civil legal machinations to prevent interference from church leadership. They never accepted church tax exemptions, so they paid civil taxes to remain outside of church rule. And so on a material level, they were really smart about maintaining their autonomy as communities. And also, women in Beguinages were safe from rape to a great extent. And rape at that time, it was a popular thing for men to do, to try and rape wealthier women and then force them into marriage to save their reputations. And so women in Beguinages didn't have to worry about that. On a spiritual level, the women disavowed the need for male intermediaries in their religious practice, and they took it upon themselves to translate theological works and to have theological discussion. There are a lot of really impressive writings that come out of the Beguine spiritual tradition. I won't go into so much, but a lot of mystical, a lot of the sort of great medieval mystics were involved in the movement. Socially, the women fell outside of or put themselves outside of the patriarchally assigned roles and lived without male supervision. So they were neither nuns nor wives or mothers, and they did away with having men overseeing the way that they lived their lives. And that was not well received ultimately. And so there really was a very severe backlash that lasted centuries against the Beguines. And it came from three directions. The first was from women's families. So there was harassment from families upset by daughters choosing the Beguine life, which they viewed as an attempt to escape from, quote, lawful male authority and the duties of married life, which indeed that is presumably what the young women were doing. So perceptive, but this led to harassment. There was also, as I said, persecution by competing professional guilds. The Beguines' success in textiles put them in competition with men, and the men lobbied for laws that were passed that set limits on Beguines' income, their cloth output, even their use of spindles. And then the men in these professional guilds would also threaten women with, or in fact, accuse women of heresy, which to eliminate the competition, to hold them in thrall a bit. And then obviously the major source of backlash was the church itself, with these accusations of heresy, which could get and did get women in the Beguine movement executed. So there's a really lovely quote from a fellow called Bishop Bruno of Uma, who complained to the Pope in 1273 that Beguines, quote, used their liberty as a veil of wickedness in order to escape the yoke of obedience to their priests and the coercion of marital bonds, which I'm all for liberty as a veil of wickedness to escape the yoke of obedience. I think we should continue with that as much as possible. But Bishop Bruno was not a fan, and he recommended that all of the Beguines be married or thrust into approved orders and put back under the thumb of male authority. The Beguines were accused of heresy. They were also accused of various kinds of sexual immorality, as women are whenever they do things in public. So they're accused of being promiscuous. The Beguine houses were charged with being brothels. Women were charged with the seduction of monks. And that helped to lose popular support for the women. And the real kind of what called open season on the Beguine movement was in 1312. Pope Clement V put out an official edict condemning the Beguines and calling for them to abandon their way of life and likening them to various movements that had been declared heretical. He said that since these women promise no obedience to anyone and do not renounce their property or profess to an approved rule, they are certainly not religious. And he said that the Beguine way of life was to be permanently forbidden and altogether excluded from the Church of God. And so this direction from the Pope gave church authorities leeway to really crack down on the Beguine communities in this time in the 14th century. The Beguinages were dissolved. A lot of their property was confiscated by the church. Women were forced into convents or back to their families. And there were also, the Beguines had a lot of popular support. They provided healthcare and education. So they were really well liked in the cities and towns they where they set up. But the church stipulated punishments for people who helped the Beguines, and that was very damaging as well. And so as the centuries passed, the beginning in the 14th century through to the 17th century or so, the Beguines were increasingly marginalized, and the communities grew smaller and smaller and smaller, and were just facing continuous attack. And eventually, kind of where they had once been held in real popular esteem, they came to carry they came to be categorized sort of as undesirables. And also worth noting is that in Germany in particular, the confiscation of Beguine property provided the economic base for the inquisitions of the 14th and 15th or the 15th and 16th centuries, which would lead to the execution of thousands of women as witches. And it's been speculated that a lot of the women, many of the women who were executed as witches, had been involved in Beguine communities. And so I really am amazed by the Beguines and what they were able to accomplish, and saddened but not surprised by what happened to them. I think it's really instructive to see just how consistent that dynamic is. And I think from a radical feminist perspective, I know that our goal is transformation of society at large. Is not necessarily the creation of like utopian enclaves, but I do think that you can see with the Beguines quite clearly the necessity and the power of these kinds of enclaves to give space for women to establish self-sufficiency and to have the sort of psychic space outside of male dominion to begin to envision a new culture for themselves and for women that could be scaled out to the culture at large.
So our next speaker is Lorraine Nowlin. She's going to introduce the video that she made with Umi Ray, who's a birth worker. Lorraine Nowlin facilitates WGI Black Women's Caucus and serves on the board of directors. She runs the Substack lorrainenowlin.substack.com. So we'll put a link to that. So Lorraine, you're muted. You're unmuted. Welcome, and it's great to have you here. The video itself is amazing, so which is why we want to show it again, because not everybody's seen it, but it's also really great for you to introduce it. So over to you to introduce it.
First, I want to say thank you to the organizers of Feminist Question Time for presenting our interview with birth worker Umi Ray. In the video, she speaks a little bit about her process to a more authentically woman-centered form of activism, and how the movement to erase mothers and women in general is intruding on the field of birth work. We hope that all of you will be inspired to continue in this fight to protect women and girls from this erasure. Thank you. I am Lorraine Nowlin, the facilitator of the Black Women's Caucus of the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International. I'd like to introduce you to an amazing woman doing amazing work, Umi Ray. She is a mother and birth worker with a passion for Black women's maternal health and wellness. Umi Ray, thank you again so much for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure, thanks for having me. I'm a mom of three. I'm a home educator. I'm a student of herbalism. I've been a birth nerd for the past 11 years. And in September of 2023, I finally became a trained doula. Prior to just staying at home with my children and being a steward of my home, I have a background in the nonprofit sector. I was in AmeriCorps for 3 terms, and that's like Peace Corps, but in America. And so I was stationed in Denver, right outside of St. Louis, and Wilmington, Delaware. And so I have an extensive background in like community development and organizing, and also youth development, working particularly with at-risk youth. So all of that to say, before we move on to the next question, I joined AmeriCorps in 2009, and I was stationed in Denver, Colorado. And so that is where I was exposed to, I guess, very liberal and progressive politics. And I really felt like I found my tribe. I was like, this is my work. I was the social justice warrior before it became a bad thing. So wokeism has been a part of my life for a very, very long time. Of course, living in Denver, Colorado, I was in like the epicenter of wokeness. So I say that because I think a lot of people like to assume that gender critical Black women are Christian and like super conservative. And it's like, no, I've been there, done that. So
right. Well, again, as a mother myself, thank you so much for the work that you are doing on behalf of Black expectant moms.
yes.
Okay. Gender identity ideology is spreading like wildfire in all facets of society. What led to your awareness of this damaging issue?
Okay, so my story starts in, well, part of my story starts in 2018. I had my son in 2014, and within days, severe postpartum depression came over me, like just a blanket of deep sadness.
Wow.
And so I tried everything for 4 years. I changed my diet. I became raw vegan. I got deep into New Age spirituality. I went deeper into woke politics. I felt like I tried everything and everything. I did the tarot cards. I did the Reiki healing, all the crystals, the green juice fast, and nothing was taken away this postpartum depression. And I think people have this misconception that postpartum depression just goes away magically after 2 years.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. And so I was at my lowest point in 2018, in the summer of 2018. I was weary, I was tired, and I wanted to give up.
Wow.
And so the only thing that saved me, and I hesitate in saying this because I know this isn't everyone's experience, but really finding out I was pregnant with my daughter did save me.
Wow.
And so this is a really crazy story because the day I found out I was pregnant on August 18th of 2018 in the morning, and I said, enough is enough. I'm done with New Age spirituality. I'm done with constantly trying to find an answer to my depression. I need professional help.
Right.
So I found an African-centered therapist, and she happened to be 5 minutes away from where I lived. And I called her that night and I told her everything I was going through. And she was just like, this is your lucky day. Someone just canceled. Can you get here within 10 minutes? And I was like, yes. After I got off the phone with her, I just dropped to my knees.
Wow.
And I hadn't really prayed those whole 4 years. Everything I was doing, I never prayed. It was all about like manifesting and all of that kind of stuff. I never prayed. I dropped to my knees and I prayed, and I just thank God. Now, this is not a story of me going from New Age to Christianity. I don't want you to think it's one of those stories, but I did. I dropped to my knees and I prayed and I cried. And I went and saw this African-centered therapist. And she gave me kind of a new perspective on my mental health. And she's like, as a Black woman, we don't have the support, right? Like our moms aren't walking us through postpartum. And we don't have the help. We don't have the village anymore. And so she gave me a place to place my depression because I no longer felt shame and guilt. I realized that there were bigger things at play.
Wow.
And so I realized that like how racism and even sexism and misogyny could play a part in your mental health. Okay, so all of that. I dug deeper into Black radical feminist work around that time. She kind of inspired me, you know. So of course I'm reading bell hooks. I used to love reading poetry of Nikki Giovanni's while I was pregnant. So I got into all of that. So I'm a millennial. So now I'm looking for Black radical feminists online. So I'm finding Black radical feminists online. And one of the first videos I found was a woman who did like a parody rap on hoteps. And you know what hoteps are.
Yes, yes.
Black men from the conscious community.
Yes.
And I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. I love this. I love that she's clapping back at Black men. I also started to realize that more and more of these women were identifying as queer, identifying as femme, and I was all for it. I was like, yes, let's get free. This is the work, the liberation work, fine. And I'm pregnant, mind you, I'm pregnant. So I'm having my daughter at the birth center. It's in a white, very white, liberal and upper class community. And they were heavy on the virtue signaling. So they were calling, of course, they were calling us birthing people, Black Lives Matter stickers everywhere. And it almost made me sick to my stomach when I was pregnant, because I'm like, y'all really don't care. Even though I was receiving the care there, I could feel like y'all really don't care about Black women, you know? So that left a bad taste in my mouth. And just hearing myself referred to as a birthing person, I was like, it kind of sounds better coming from Black women. I don't know why this like white middle class white woman is calling me a birthing person. Right. So it started to get weird. And so this is what's really interesting. And I just wish more Black women would talk about this, because I almost feel like I was in the Twilight Zone. Wow. So the thing with Black radical feminists in 2018 and prior to that, they were calling out Black men for being misogynistic and homophobic and engaging in revisionist history. So Black men were trying to tell us like we should all be practicing polyamory, yet they don't have the tradition and culture around polyamory to make it work. Right. You know what I mean? We were talking about Black men gaslighting us, right? All of these things. And then those same women, some of those same women today are doing the same exact thing to Black women. And I'm like, wait, did we forget that we were calling out Black men for doing this? Right. I don't understand the revisionist history. Like we're saying that there's like all of these different genders that came out of Africa. Now we're practicing polyamory and we're not doing it in a responsible way. Gaslighting Black women, saying that Black women are the problem, you know, blaming Black women. So that's been weird to see in 2024, but still in 2018, that happened. 2019, gender ideology, like I still thought it was a way for Black women to get free. I read an article a Black woman wrote about realizing that she was non-binary, and I was like, yes, girl, like this is it. Yeah. So I didn't start to wake up until COVID, like a lot of people. So during COVID, I experienced 2 pregnancies, but I lost both babies in my second trimester. So I had 2 back-to-back second trimester miscarriages. Yes. And I think there's something about deep trauma like that it forces you to search for truth. Right. And like spirituality in a way, because it's like I have no choice. Wow. If I don't find more meaning in my life, then I know that I'm not going to think that life is worth living. Wow. And so, yeah, I started to, as a way to cope and a way to survive, I just started searching for truth in my life. Searching for truth. And just by the time, so my son, I got pregnant with my youngest in 2021. So I had a miscarriage in 2021, and 6 months later, I got pregnant with my son. Yes. And so now I'm going into this pregnancy and I've shed everything, like anything that seemed like a lie, all the ideologies that never served me. Like I just went into that pregnancy like a baby. Like I just wanted to learn the truth about things. Right. And I just couldn't find it in the Black birth work spaces. Because, you know, when you're pregnant, especially nowadays, you're looking for Black birth workers. Yes. You're like, where the Black birth workers at? What herbs y'all use? Like, what's up? And it was just like too political. They just wanted to talk about how we're dying and racism. And I'm like, yeah, like that's true, but we need to have solutions. Exactly. So I gravitated more to the white women in the home birth community and the free birth community, because they were talking about herbalism. They were talking really about getting free, really about desisting from allopathic medicine. Like they were speaking to me. And then that's when I found out that these women also happen to be gender critical.
Wow. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
And the free birth community is gender critical. It clicked for me. Later on, I found Whose Body Is It?
Yes, Isabella.
Isabella.
Yes.
I was like, yes, okay. And everything just started to click for me. And I was just like, wow, I thought I was so woke and I was asleep. And I want to say one more thing. At the height of my wokeism, because everybody wants to talk about the work of decolonization.
Right.
And this isn't like when I'm saying it, this isn't coming from an arrogant place, it's truth. At the height of my wokeism, I lived on a bamboo farm. I was raw vegan. My son was raw vegan. We didn't watch TV. We grew some of our own food. The only interactions I had with white people was in Whole Foods, the cashier.
Right.
My son was homeschooled, so we didn't send him to school. My partner's an entrepreneur, so he wasn't going to work for anybody.
Right.
And so at this time, I felt like I was top tier woke. You know, and internally, like, yes, I was arrogant at that time. I'm like, there is no Black people who are more woke than me. You won't find one. You won't find one. And so when people talk about the work of decolonization, I'm like, how? Who, what, when, where, how? Who do you? Yeah.
Well, first, thank you. Actually, I'm so sorry to hear about your losses.
Yeah.
You know, sorry about that. And you know, great, you have beautiful children.
Yeah.
Okay, so have you ever worked with expectant moms that believe they are men? You know, the world calls them trans men. And what specific health concerns do you know might arise with working with that population?
So I never worked with anyone who identify as a trans man. The thing with doulas is you're not there to, of course, give medical advice. You're just there to support, emotional support, and educate. But if you just look at a trans man, a medicalized trans man, they're dissociated from the female body, which means that they'll probably experience gender dysphoria throughout their pregnancy. And so this is someone who is going through a severe mental health crisis because of their body during pregnancy. And so I would just say that that's a huge risk factor. We don't know, we don't have the studies to say what testosterone actually does to a pregnant woman's body and the fetus, but I'm sure it's not good.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And then we probably, a medicalized trans man probably doesn't have breast. And so what happens when that baby is born?
Won't get the
breast. We know how beneficial breast milk is for trans men. So in the media, trans men are celebrated for becoming pregnant. And honestly, it's a shame that the only time trans men get any kind of recognition is when they're pregnant. You know, where are the trans men CEOs? We see a lot of trans women CEOs. Where are the trans men CEOs, right?
Good point. Good point.
Where are the trans men who are stellar athletes? So we center trans men who are doing the most feminine thing you can do.
Exactly. And that's the strange thing about it. It's like breasts can trigger dysphoria, but not pregnancy. Like I just don't get it. I just don't get it. What do you feel that gender identity ideology poses a risk to Black maternal health in general? Like we just mentioned, women that believe they're men, but what about to Black mothers in general? Do you think it poses a risk?
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. So one, when you use gender neutral language, it does erase mothers and women, and they try to say they don't erase mothers and women, but it does. And I give the analogy, if a trans man wants to be called he and wants to be called a birthing person, and if you don't call him a he and a birthing person, this trans identified female will let you know you're erasing my identity and you're causing harm and violence to me by not recognizing me. So what happens when you don't use the words women and mother?
Good point.
Are we not erased? Do we not face harm?
See, like I guess it doesn't matter where race.
Right. And so you have to start playing the same game. If this is the game you want to play, well, we have to play the game that's based in reality.
Reality. Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Wow.
So, and I want to add two more things, that two more
Sure.
risks.
Sure.
So LGBT, there's this thing about we need to center trans people, whatever it is, whether it's in birth work, we center trans identified people because they're most at risk. Being trans does not make you the most at risk as a Black woman. Being a Black woman makes you the most at risk. Black women face high rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, and poverty. That's what's most at risk. So when we center identities, we decenter reality. So that's another risk.
Yep, got to clap on that one. So true.
And the third risk is when we use phrases like trans men are men, we open it up for them to say phrases that trans women can breastfeed. Any trans woman that's breastfeed is exploiting and abusing a child.
Yes.
A woman's breast milk is made for that baby, specifically for that baby. You are erasing the physiological bond between a mother and her child. That breast milk is designed custom for that child.
Exactly.
No man has the right to breastfeed an infant. We are watching sexual abuse happen right before our eyes.
Absolutely.
When we look at any picture. So when it's gender ideology poses a threat to Black mothers, because a lot of Black women go around and say, well, Black trans men can have babies. Black trans men can get pregnant. Well, guess what you're opening the door to? And this is why it's so important to gatekeep.
Yes, yes, gatekeep. Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing out that point. Okay. It seems that trans ideologues deliberately attach themselves to groups without power, in this case, Black women, and we know that Black women lack power. Have you noticed the same? And are you also noticing the same type of force teaming among your white counterparts? Meaning, have you ever heard anyone say white birthing body?
No, not at all.
Interesting.
Black women, yes. Black women continue to be dehumanized in the birth work space, and we do it to ourselves. I would say the most harmful force teaming that I see, it seems like it doesn't have anything to do with the birth work world, but I pay attention more to what's going on in the Black community, and the force teaming that's happening is Black women and Black trans identified males all being a part of womanhood, right? And the main reason why they're telling us that trans identified males are actually women is because of our shared oppression. So essentially, you are asking Black women to build solidarity with trans women through a trauma bond. And if we look at the relationship between Black women and Black males, whether you're cisgender, transgender, queer, or straight, Black women have a history of trauma bonding with Black males.
Yes. Yes.
And so this is another way to get us to trauma bond with Black males and not hold them accountable for their healing.
Right. And in turn, we get erased.
And then we get erased. And it's the same thing that happened to us in the 60s and 70s in the Black liberation movement.
Right.
When Black men said, no, it's not your time right now.
It's not. I mean, it's almost like when we say Blackness, we really mean men, but, Black women need, our issues need to be addressed and solutions need to come about.
Yes.
One light thing to the audience, we're not necessarily saying that we should say white birthing bodies, but we just have to look at the difference of who's being dehumanized and who's being disrespected.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow. Do you have any support among your colleagues?
I have some support privately. I think the thing about Black birth work is that there are a lot of Black birth workers who are doing great work. I'm not going to take that from them.
Right.
I think the Black birth workers who are really doing the work and their head is down, they don't want any smoke. They just want to get the job done.
Right.
They realize that there's a Black maternal health crisis and I need to focus on this. I don't have time. I have to use my position because I am fortunate to be a stay-at-home mom, because if I can't do birth work in my community, I can still survive, right? Like, my main work right now is being a mother and is being at home with my children. And I think that's the most radical Black feminist thing that I can do right now.
Yes.
So you can't take that away from me.
Right.
So I will say there are Black women whose heads are down and they're just doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
There also are a lot of Black women who are birth workers who do engage in gender ideology. Here's the thing. Black women look at gender ideology as a form of resistance. So they're looking at it as resisting white supremacy, where white women look at it more of rebelling against the patriarchy, right? So if you are looking at this as this is a form of resistance, this is how I'm going to get free. If someone tells you that, no, babe, like this isn't the way, this isn't liberation for you, it's harder for you to give that up.
Right.
Because we deeply need our freedom. Like we deeply need our liberation. This isn't about rebellion. It's two different things. Resistance and rebellion are two different things.
Yes.
And so I think that because Black women look at this as life or death, this is the way to get free. It's just hard for them to get untangled from gender ideology because they almost feel like they're going from the field Negro to the house Negro.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing out that important point. Speaking of Black women that might be afraid to speak out, what might be some of the ramifications of speaking out? Have you ever, experienced anything yourself for speaking out?
So I was part of a Black birth work organization and I had to cut ties with them before I was canceled. But it was almost like when I heard a lot of, we're here to disrupt and we're here to deconstruct. And I came in like, have you not seen the Black community? There's enough disruption and deconstruction in our community. We need to reconstruct. We need to build. I'm not here to disrupt the system. I'm here to create new systems.
Yes.
So I never aligned with that. I never aligned with deconstructing, disrupting. Nope, I'm here to work in harmony. And so the way I come into a room and the way I sit is like, yes, I'm a stay-at-home mom. Yes, I'm a home educator. Yes, I'm a student of herbalism. All of this is fine. Everybody would love me if I said all of these things. But then in front of it, I said, and I'm queer and I'm femme. Then that validates what I'm doing.
Right.
Because if I say that I'm a stay-at-home mom and I'm a home educator and I do this, it's not it doesn't align with Black radical feminism enough.
Right.
And so in terms of what are the ramifications? I already saw the ramifications because I would see how the energy would change when I wouldn't say the things that they wanted me to say.
Right. Wow. That's, I've noticed that myself. Speaking of ramifications, is there a network of support either locally or nationally for birth workers that do embrace the reality of biological sex?
There's not a network of support. I mean, you will find Black birth workers who don't who don't adhere to gender ideology. But no, there's no network of support. I want to start a network of support.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, there's Mary Lou Singleton. She's a midwife. There's a woman, Millie Hill. There's some organizations in the UK who I closely follow. But other than that, no.
Wow. Well, I hope you do move forward with, a network of support because it's so needed. It's a shame that, women are just living in fear for speaking the truth. Truth. Is there anything else you plan to do moving forward?
Yeah, so Reclaiming Our Rights is that's the social media handle that I started. And I really want to make something big out of this because I told you my background, in liberal progressive politics. And I feel like I'm such a great person to bridge the gap because I really still stay connected with Black radical feminism as much as I can. I still follow everybody. So all of that to say is I started Reclaiming Our Rights, RITES, because we know that Black women have lost the tradition of rites of passage. And rites of passage is embodiment work. And Black women are totally disembodied and disassociated. And once you make space in your body and you can live in your body, gender ideology has no place.
Wow.
It has no pace. So
Mhm.
I'm here to educate Black women on what our cultural rites of passage were and what it looks like now through the perspective and the lens of Black radical feminism.
Well, thank you very much for that. And again, thank you very much for the work that you are doing on behalf of Black expectant moms, Black mothers, and Black women in general.
Yes.
To our audience, if you are so inclined, you may click on the link to read and sign our declaration. And also you will find a link to Umi Ray's Instagram page where you can find out more about her amazing work. Thank you very much, Umi Ray, and it was just a wonderful interview.
Thank you.
Again,
Yes.
thank you for the knowledge on free birthers. I never would have thought.
Yes.
Oh my God, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. People remember that.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all again for watching. And remember, once all of us women get on board, we all win. Because, you know, the TRAs, they're working really, really hard to get their so-called points, which are wrong, across. So we have to do what we can to win this fight. And I'm glad to be with all of you, Black, white, Asian, all of you.
Brilliant. So we're now going to Angela Wilde, and Angela is she's a political artist, a lesbian feminist, activist, and a writer. She's a former founder member of the lesbian activist group Get the L Out UK, author of the research on the cotton ceiling, lesbians at ground zero, and the creator of Wild Women Workshop. I'm wearing one of your things, one of the t-shirts. This is one of them. A radical feminist shop for activists. Her written work features in spinning and weaving radical feminism for the 21st century, and her visual work was endorsed by feminist activist and author J.K. Rowling. And the title of your talk, Angela, is No Men Beyond This Point.
So today I wanted to speak about an art project for change. It's called No Men Beyond This Point, and tagline also Women Holding the Line. You will see why. And it's a conceptual radfem art project I've worked for a few years, so I'm really excited to be able to talk about it. And to describe it shortly, it's a portable women-only space, so a kit. You can see it's, you cannot see yet, you can see it's a bag, and it contains a kit that allows women to set up a women's space in public. And that wherever you may be, you can do that in a park, in the street, in the supermarket, anywhere outside. It has 6 concrete bases, 6 extendable poles, and more importantly, it also have a very long yellow safety tape printed with the words "Women only, no men beyond this point." So as you can see, excellent. That's it now. Thank you very much. I just wanted to show different pictures so you can see the different element of it. And so as you can see, it's portable. You can carry it around, and it's kind of a lady's handbag. I've got it here. It's just like a nondescript bag. It just has the word woman on it. And I thought it was important to have a non-conspicuous handbag, something that is traditionally understood as a feminine accessory, so we can carry it around, we go unnoticed. It doesn't attract attention, but inside there is a radical feminist tool of defiance. In fact, there's a tool to create something that patriarchy disapprove of, and we've seen with Aurora how much. It's a tool to create separatism. So it's a separatist bag in a way. The inspiration for this, I made it because as a radical feminist, I think especially all of us in this talk, we understand politically the importance of women-only spaces. But I think with the trans debate, there's been many places that many of us have taken for granted in our lives, like women's toilets, like fitting rooms, and many other places and those places have become battleground. Men have worked out new strategies to enter those places that until now, these women's spaces were legally denied to men, but now they call themselves women and they go in. Depending on which country you're in, they're actually legally allowed. And because thanks to, in fact, all the feminist work that has been done for the last 10 years or so, it has now become a very contemporary issue. And in fact, a mainstream issue. Thankfully, a lot of women who aren't calling themselves feminist understand and are aware of this problem. And so my idea for this kit came from the simple observation that from my own experience as well, how many women have had the experience of defending a woman-only space? How many women do we know who have created a space like this? How many women have been in an intentionally created women-only space, what we call separatism? And how does it feel to create those spaces? How does it feel to maintain them in the face of potential hostility? What are the responses to women creating really literally a square meter of independence? How do we deal as women with potential conflict? How do we maintain such a space in the face of potential male hostility and violence? And so I think it's a challenging thing for women to do. I've experienced it, it is hard, mainly because men are hostile and violent when women say no and when we set up boundaries, but also because women have been socialized, we have all been socialized since birth to have no boundaries and to never say no to men. In fact, we are told on a daily basis that being kind, to be kind, and it's not kind to say no, and that it's not kind to exclude. So for many women, the idea of confronting a man that turns up in a woman's space would probably be very challenging, even scary, and for good reasons. We know of the violence. And so it occurred to me that we needed those kits to put ourselves in this situation, to learn and to train ourselves. And of course, this is not just about toilets or fitting rooms. It is really a much wider, deeper discussion. It's a discussion about language, about the impact that language we use has in our rights and the space that we have. It is a feminist political conversation. So with this piece, when I am creating a woman-only space around me, and when I invite women inside it, and only women inside it, I define a space, but I also define a meaning. Definitions are linguistic boundaries. Defining a word is literally placing a limit around its meaning. A definition delimitates what the word means from what it doesn't mean. Apples are not oranges in the same way that men are not women. And women has a specific meaning, which by definition exclude those who are not women. It's obvious, isn't it? And people who insist that men can be women often accuse us of gatekeeping the word woman. So yes, we are, and Lorraine, you were saying the same 5 minutes ago, this is exactly what we are doing. We are indeed gatekeeping the meaning of the word woman. So what I'm trying to do with this artwork is to make this debate visual, to make it in three-dimensional shape, to take it outside of the theory, to make it into an art form and a visual form. And it also raises the political question about women's rights to boundary, women's rights to self-definition. We women, as an oppressed group, we have the right to define ourselves, and we have the right to exclude men from our definition of ourselves, from our spaces. And so the message of really that project is the word woman is a woman-only space, and we need to keep it. And all these questions, of course, are all interwoven. And so the wider radical feminist significance of this is separatism, really. The topic of women's space is not specific to the trans debate. It's a long-standing discussion that radical feminists, that lesbian feminists have had about our rights to organize without men. Many women hate the word or the very idea of separatism because it means setting a boundary, because it means well, when you do set a boundary, you know, originally, immediately we get called a man hater. And because it means excluding men that maybe we have in our lives, and that it's a potential confrontation. Women don't like to do it. So any discussion about separatism usually brings a lot of strong negative feelings. We get told we are unrealistic. We get told we are unpractical. There's a lot of defenses in place. But I'd argue that separatism is a key principle of feminism. There can be no feminism without women organizing, without men. We have to set boundaries. We have to say no. We have to have our spaces. And it's a little sideline. Those who think it's unrealistic and unpractical should have a look at the Korean 4B movement, where the key principles is no dating men, no sex with men, no marriage to men, no children with men. And the way it's developing, and it seems to be really popular, like it's gaining a lot of traction. I think it's one of the most exciting feminist development I've ever seen, and it is based on these principles. And so that brings me to what's happening this summer. So of course, the project No Men Beyond This Point is an art project, but it's also, and maybe more specifically, a radical feminist activist tool project. And its purpose is to be used in real life. It's street art. It does not belong in a gallery. It belongs in the real world. And in fact, its purpose is to protect any women's space that need defending. And one such women's space that need defending in the UK is Hampstead Heath Ladies Pond, for example. So I know you had Venice Allen a few weeks ago talking about this. I know there's been very, like a lot of activism around this place because it's a really important landmark of feminist, a feminist space, a lesbian space, a woman's space. But in recent years, the Ladies Pond has been the site of men's invasion. And since 2019, men have been allowed to enter the pond if they declare themselves to be women. But of course, no man is and will ever be a woman. I don't know if you've ever been, but the pond is a wonderful place. It has a lot of emotional significance for a lot of women. For me, I discovered this place about 12 years ago when I was really unwell. I had left an abusive relationship with a man, and the pond's beauty, its magic, the woman's spaceness of it, the fact that it was exclusive to us, meant it was a place of safety and healing. And I was truly devastated by the invasion of men in this place. So the Ladies Pond exists for women's enjoyment, safely and outside of the male gaze. And the Ladies Pond does not exist to fulfill male sexual fantasies, and it certainly does not exist to validate man's man-made gender identity. So on the 28th of July, myself and Michelle are organizing a direct action. And we will surround the pond of Hampstead Heath with the tape that I mentioned, all around it, and we will make it a women-only space. So, of course, two of us is not going to be enough to do that, so we need you. So there's really three things you could do to make this action happen. First of all is turn up, come and hold the line with us, physical line, that line around the pond, and say no to men and keep our space for ourselves. We will meet on the 28th of July at midday. So bring a friend, bring your sister, bring your mom, bring a neighbor, any woman, a picnic, a bathing suit. Of course, this will be a woman-only action, obviously. The other thing you can do, and you've got the link here on the flyer, is we need money. Basically, you can support this action and help make it happen. We have a fundraiser. So if you can afford a few pounds, please support our fundraiser. And if you finance this, if you help us make it happen, you support the creation of radical feminist art. There aren't that much of it around. You make a unique radical feminist live art performance possible. And of course, you actively support a real life women-only space. And the third thing that you can do, if you're interested, obviously, is share the link, share this talk, share the flyers if you have one. I know I've started distributing them. Network on your social media everywhere. And so that's it for me. And I hope to see all of you on the 28th of July at the pond.
We're now going to play the video of Joanna Cherry, who is a UK parliamentarian. It's Lesbian Visibility Week this week, and she did an amazing speech in the House of Commons in Britain.
But the website put up for this week says it's about the power, or celebrating the power, of sisterhood by uplifting incredible LGBTQIA women and non-binary people. And I think it's a real shame that in the week about our visibility, the lesbian identity is being subsumed into a number of other identities which have nothing to do with being a same-sex attracted woman. Many lesbians fundamentally disagree with this, and I want to speak up for them today. They need someone to speak up for them. It's a mark of how marginalised lesbians have become in our society that so few honourable members have turned up today. That's the reason I'm speaking from the SNP front bench, despite having been removed from it several years ago, partly for being the wrong sort of lesbian and one who doesn't believe that the rights of men who say they are women should trump those of lesbians. Before I go any further, I want to declare an interest as a supporter of LGB Alliance and a member of the advisory boards of both the Lesbian Project and Sex Matters. But my main interest in this issue is that I am a lesbian. I came out in the 80s when homophobia and lesbophobia were still rife across the UK, and my first activism was against Clause 28. In those times, like many other lesbians, I was physically assaulted in the street for being a lesbian and mocked. And lesbians of my generation also faced losing our jobs and our children. For a long time, we thought lesbophobia had gone. But lesbophobia is back, and it has been created by those who think the rights of lesbians are conditional on them accepting gender identity ideology. They are not. Lesbians are same-sex attracted women, and we are protected on that basis from discrimination, bullying and harassment under the Equality Act, where our protected characteristic is sexual orientation. Our protection is on the basis of our sex, not our gender, and as J.K. Rowling has said, without sex, there can be no same-sex attraction. That is why lesbians like me fight the replacement of the biological reality of sex with the nebulous concept of gender. Now, a moment ago, I used the phrase that the rights of lesbians are not conditional on accepting gender identity theory. That's a direct quote from my friend Alison Bailey. As some members will know, Alison Bailey is a black lesbian barrister who nearly lost her job for standing up for the rights of lesbians. Other lesbians have faced similar persecution. My friends Kate Harris, Bev Jackson and Eileen Gallagher had to fight a lengthy court battle to protect their charity, LGB Alliance, from being removed from the charitable register as a result of malicious legal action. Justice prevailed and they won the case, but shamefully, those who sought to destroy a charity run by lesbians for lesbians included members of this House. And it wasn't the first time that members of this House have displayed hostility towards lesbians. As the Father of the House said a moment ago, when I was invited to speak on a cross-party panel at the first LGB Alliance conference back in October 2021, I faced the challenge of crossing a picket line which included a heterosexual female MP who, together with self-styled trans rights activists, was protesting against the rights of lesbians to organise a conference to talk about lesbian and gay rights. Just let that sink in. That's where we've got to. Heterosexuals telling lesbians that we can't hold a conference. Now, there are many lesbians who have been persecuted for refusing to bend their knee to gender identity ideology. Some have faced losing their jobs and their livelihoods, and some have also faced violence or the threats of violence. And I want to just name a few of them this afternoon. All of them are or have become my friends as a result of our struggle. Lucy Massoud, Professor Kathleen Stock, Julie Bindel, Professor Joe Phoenix, and my dear friend Dr. Shireen Benjamin, a Labour activist who has been treated appallingly by the University of Edinburgh. There are many other lesbians whose lives have been severely restricted by gender identity zealots. We're not allowed to have lesbian-only social events. The only venues left for lesbians say they are inclusive, and that means men are included. Women's sports are also now inclusive, which means that they include men, while excluding lesbians who want to play on women-only teams. Recently, a lesbian coming to view democracy in action at the Scottish Parliament was told by security that she could not enter the building wearing a small pin badge reading Scottish lesbians. I'm wearing that same badge today in solidarity with Scottish lesbians who are an excellent grassroots lesbian collective. Across the United Kingdom, lesbians have been intimidated at pride marches, spat on and assaulted for simply asserting their rights to say that lesbians are same-sex attracted. And at a recent event for women in Edinburgh, men, counter-protesters, held up vile, abusive, lesbophobic signs. The police did nothing because for all the furore in Scotland about hate crime, it seems that hate directed at lesbians doesn't count. Now, I don't believe the interests of lesbians are being properly represented by organisations such as Stonewall and the organisers of Lesbian Visibility Week. because in their determination to promote gender identity ideology and to keep themselves in a job by doing that, not only do they fail to represent lesbians, but they actually promote lesbian invisibility and lesbian erasure. Madam Deputy Speaker, most people think it is absurd to say that a man can be a lesbian, and most people think it's absurd to say that lesbians have penises. And they are right, it is absurd. And I'm proud to be able to stand up in Lesbian Visibility Week in the House of Commons and say so. And I'm proud that I can stand up and speak for the lesbians who reject the forced teaming of lesbian with other groups that have completely different issues from us. Stop lumping us together with those other groups. It has the effect that our interests are obscured or overlooked altogether, and it renders us invisible. It's interesting to reflect on the fact that back in 2021, the Inclusive Britain report found that aggregate terms like BAME were no longer helpful and took no account of the differing needs and outcomes of those included under that umbrella, and that they should be dropped. And the findings of that report were adopted by the government, and the acronym BAME is no longer used in government. I and many other lesbians think the same principles should be applied to acronyms like LGBTQIA+, so that lesbians are not force-teamed with other identities. Now, yes, of course.
Very grateful to the Honourable Lady. And actually reflecting on the speech we heard earlier from my friend, Honourable Member for Brent Central, what we could all benefit from in this debate is a little bit more love and compassion, and anybody that is setting out to do anything other than demonstrate love to people that they'll think differently, then perhaps they need to think again.
Well, yes. But there also has to be room for difference, and there has to be room for someone such as me to speak up on behalf of some lesbians who feel the way that I do. And we're quite large in number. I don't pretend to speak for all lesbians, but none of the other lesbians in this House speak for all lesbians either. I am putting forward what I consider to be a valid viewpoint. Most importantly, it is a viewpoint that is backed by the law of this land. Now, I'm constrained by not having as much time as I would have liked. I would have liked to have talked about the Cass report. I would have liked to have talked about how the Cass report has identified that a large percentage of the girls presenting with gender dysphoria are same-sex attracted young women. And I would like to have time to talk about how important it is that we don't shut down holistic talking therapy for such young women. But I'm going to bring my comments to a close now by saying this. In my belief, in the view of many lesbians and in the eyes of the law, a lesbian is a woman whose sexual orientation is towards other women. Those who think lesbians include men are deluded. You cannot be a responsible lawmaker if you believe that any man can be a woman just by saying so. That's an old joke, worthy of the worst nights in student union bars back in my youth, with drunk testosterone-fueled men telling me and other lesbians that all we needed was the right man. In future, let's try and retain our grasp on what a lesbian is. Many lesbians are sick of being bossed about by all of those who promote their cult beliefs that gender trumps sex. It doesn't, it never has, and it never will.